Hello, this is David Byrne, Director of the Federal Voting Assistance Program at the U.S. Department of Defense. This video will review Section B of the 2018 Election Administration and Voting Survey, or EAVS. This section seeks to understand voters in your jurisdiction who are covered under the Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act, or UOCAVA. Section B is the result of a partnership between the Election Assistance Commission and the Federal Voting Assistance Program to collect, share, and evaluate data on the voting experience of citizens covered under UOCAVA. These questions are being asked in a single survey to reduce the data collection burden on local election officials while still allowing the EAC and FWAB to fulfill their congressionally mandated requirements to study UOCAVA voters. You can find similar presentations for the other 5 sections of the survey on the EAVS portal and the Election Assistance Commission website. As you watch this video, you might want to follow along with the PDF version of the survey, which can be found on the Downloads page of the EAVS portal. Section B of EAVS asks for the following information about UOCAVA voters in the 2018 election. First, how many voters in your jurisdiction were registered as UOCAVA voters? Second, how many federal postcard applications, or FPCAs, were received, accepted, and rejected? Third, how many ballots were transmitted to UOCAVA voters? How many were returned? And of the returned ballots, how many were counted and how many were rejected? And finally, how many federal write-in absentee ballots, or FWABs, did your office receive, reject, and accept? Throughout this section, most of the questions will ask you to report these numbers in total and also to break them down according to the type of UOCAVA voter. Lastly, if you have completed Section B in a previous version of EAVS, you'll notice some changes this year. In 2016, some of the questions in this section were grayed out, and respondents were not required to answer them. In the 2018 version, those questions have been removed from the survey. Please answer all questions in this section as fully as you can. Many of the questions in this section have also been restructured or renumbered from previous years, so we recommend carefully reviewing the entire section before answering any of the questions. Before we begin discussing the questions in Section B, there are some important definitions to know. UOCAVA covers several populations, but there are 2 groups of voters you'll be asked about in the EAVS. First, uniformed service voters. These are members of the United States Armed Forces, the Merchant Marine, and the Commission Corps of the Public Health Service and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration who are away from their place of residence. It is very important to note that these service members' spouses and dependents are also considered uniformed service voters. These uniformed service voters and their family members may be residing domestically or overseas, but if they're absent from the place of residence where they're eligible to vote, they are covered by UOCAVA and are counted as uniformed service voters. The second group of UOCAVA voters is non-military and civilian U.S. citizens living overseas. This distinction is important to remember because most questions in Section B will ask you to divide the totals you report into these 2 categories. When you do this, the number of uniformed service voters and civilian overseas voters should sum to the total count that you report. Again, please remember to count family members of active duty military or Merchant Marine members as uniformed service voters when you report your data. If your jurisdiction doesn't collect the data to distinguish between uniformed services and civilian overseas UOCAVA voters, you will report this data as not available in your responses. If you're using the Excel template, enter -99 into the cells. If you're using the online template, select the Data Not Available checkbox for these questions. Some states extend additional protections for voters similar to those under UOCAVA, such as National Guard members who are activated on state orders. If your state allows other populations to register as UOCAVA voters, they should be included in the data you report in Section B. Some states also have a form other than FPCAs that voters can use to register as UOCAVA voters. Individuals who use these state forms are considered UOCAVA voters for purposes of EAVS. However, questions B2 through B4 ask specifically about FPCAs, and UOCAVA voters who used other registration forms should not be included in these questions. Next, let's discuss the types of UOCAVA absentee ballots you'll be reporting. Here again, there are 2 categories. The first is a transmitted ballot, which is a ballot your office sends to a voter. They can be transmitted through the postal mail, through email or by fax. But what makes it a transmitted ballot is that it originated from the election office. Federal write-in absentee ballots, or FWABs, on the other hand, originate from voters. Many UOCAVA voters will return a FWAB if their requested absentee ballot doesn't arrive in time. Once again, FWABs can be sent to your office through several methods, but these FWABs originate from the voter, not from the election office. Data on FWABs will be reported only in questions B23 through B26. When you are reporting data about UOCAVA ballots your office transmitted, received, and counted in questions B5 through B22, do not include any FWABs in what you report. With those definitions in mind, let's review the questions in Section B. The first data you'll provide is the total number of voters in your jurisdiction who were registered eligible UOCAVA voters in the November 2018 election. This number will be reported in B1A. Next, you'll subdivide that number into uniformed service voters and civilian overseas voters in B1B and B1C. Use the Not Available code or checkbox if your jurisdiction doesn't distinguish between types of UOCAVA voters. If your jurisdiction didn't have any UOCAVA eligible voters in this election, then you will enter 0 as your answer to B1A. The next group of questions ask about FPCAs. These are applications UOCAVA eligible voters can use to register to vote and request an absentee ballot for a federal election. As we discussed previously, this question applies only to FPCAs, not to other methods UOCAVA voters can use to register or request ballots. In question B2, you will report the total number of FPCAs your jurisdiction received for the 2018 general election. B3 and B4 ask how many of those FPCAs were rejected. FPCAs rejected because they didn't meet eligibility requirements, for instance, they lacked signatures or weren't from an eligible UOCAVA voter, will be reported in B3. FPCAs rejected because they were received after the deadline will be reported in B4. Note that questions B2 and B3 ask you to separate the totals out by the type of UOCAVA voter, but you do not need to do this in question B4. The next part of Section B asks about UOCAVA ballots transmitted to voters. As a reminder, this only includes ballots transmitted from the election office to the voter. First, in question B5, you will report the total number of absentee ballots transmitted to UOCAVA voters. Then, in B6, 7, and 8, you will report how many of those ballots were transmitted by postal mail, by email, or by other modes. All 4 of these questions will have you separate out uniformed service voters and civilian overseas voters. If your jurisdiction didn't transmit any UOCAVA ballots to voters in the 2018 election, then report 0 for B5A. If you are using the Excel template, leave the columns for B6 through B22 blank and skip down to answering question B23. If you are using the online template, leave the remainder of the question grid blank and the survey will automatically take you to B23 when you click Continue. The next set of questions applies to transmitted UOCAVA ballots that voters returned to the election office. Once again, this does not include FWABs. You will notice that this question set is structured very similar to B5 through B8. For this set of questions, B9 asks for the total number of ballots returned. B10 asks about ballots returned by postal mail. B11 asks about ballots returned by email. And B12 asks about ballots returned by other modes. Once more, you will report uniformed service voters and civilian overseas voters separately in addition to the totals. Some UOCAVA ballots your jurisdiction sends may be returned as undeliverable. The mailing address or email address may have been incorrect, or the ballot was sent to a bad fax number. These undeliverable ballots will be reported in question B13. You will report the total undeliverable ballots in B13A and use B, C, and D to report undeliverable ballots based on their mode of transmission. For this question, you do not have to report by uniform service or civilian UOCAVA voters. Next, in questions B14 through B17, you'll report on UOCAVA ballots counted in the November 2018 election. Just like in previous question sets, you'll report the total number and then break that down further based on the mode of ballot return and by the type of UOCAVA voter. The final set of UOCAVA ballot questions is about rejected ballots. Rather than breaking down the totals by method of transmission, instead, you will break down the data according to the reason for rejection. Ballots received after the deadline will be reported in B19. Ballots with a signature problem will be reported in B20. Ballots without a postmark will be reported in B21, and ballots rejected for other reasons will be reported in B22. It is helpful for the Federal Voting Assistance Program to know more about the specific reasons each UOCAVA ballot is rejected, so more information is better. In addition to reporting the totals for these rejection reasons, you will break the totals out into uniform service voters and civilian overseas voters. The final set of questions in Section B is about federal write-in absentee ballots, or FWABs. Only FWABs, not any other UOCAVA absentee ballot, should be recorded in this section. As with previous question sets, you will report the total number of FWABs returned, counted, and rejected. B25 asks for FWABs rejected because they were received after the deadline. B26 asks for FWABs rejected because the voter's regular absentee ballot was received and counted. If your jurisdiction rejected FWABs for other reasons, please indicate that in the comments section. Also, like previous questions, you'll report the number of uniform service voters and civilian overseas voters in each category in addition to the total numbers. We appreciate you taking the time to watch this video. We encourage you to carefully read through each section before answering any of the questions to ensure you are accurately reporting your jurisdiction's data. The easiest way to view the survey and its instructions is by accessing the PDF version of the 2018 survey on the Downloads page of the EAVS portal. We also encourage you to use the comment boxes for each question to provide us with additional information and context. This will help us analyze and report your data accurately. If you need additional assistance, please do not hesitate to contact EAVS at forcemarshgroup.com. All emails sent to that address will be answered within 1 business day. Thank you, and we appreciate your time and your contributions to the 2018 EAVS survey.